What would you do if your country told you that your sacrifice meant nothing? Imagine receiving the highest military honor for valor in combat, only to have it stripped away with a single bureaucratic stamp, reading void. For most men, this would be the end of the story, a bitter conclusion to a distinguished career. But for one extraordinary American warrior, it became the beginning of something far more remarkable. This is the story of a soldier whose courage couldn't be contained by prison walls, whose determination couldn't be broken by official rejection, and whose tactical brilliance would rewrite the rules of amphibious warfare. It's a tale that challenges everything we think we know about military heroism, about justice, and about what it means to serve when your service is no longer wanted. The man at the center of this story would become one of the most controversial and celebrated figures in American military history. Yet his name remains largely unknown outside military circles. His journey from decorated hero to prisoner to pioneering commando leader reveals uncomfortable truths about honor, authority, and the price of standing by one's principles in wartime. This isn't just another war story. It's an examination of what happens when individual conscience collides with institutional power, when the machinery of military justice grinds against the reality of battlefield necessity, and when a single man's refusal to accept defeat changes the course of military innovation forever. The events that unfold challenge our assumptions about military discipline, about the nature of heroism, and about whether institutions designed to protect us sometimes become the very obstacles that prevent exceptional individuals from making their greatest contributions. The story begins not with triumph but with disgrace, not in the heat of battle, but in the cold machinery of military justice. It unfolds across the jungles of Burma, through the bureaucratic corridors of military headquarters, and finally in the dark waters where a desperate gamble would either vindicate a disgraced officer or cement his failure forever. Every element of this narrative forces us to confront difficult questions about authority and conscience, about rules and exceptions, about what we owe to institutions and what we owe to truth. Charles Henry Hunter Jr. was born in 1906, in the waning years of the Gilded Age, growing up in an America still defining itself as a global power. By the time he reached adulthood, the nation had emerged from World War I as a major player on the international stage, yet its military remained relatively small and insular. Hunter came from a military family, one where service wasn't simply a career choice, but a calling passed down through generations. His father had served with distinction, and young Charles absorbed lessons about duty and honor from his earliest days. The America of Hunter's youth was rapidly transforming. The 1920s brought unprecedented prosperity, but also social upheaval as traditional values collided with modern sensibilities. The military establishment, however, remained largely unchanged, clinging to traditions and hierarchies that had roots in the 19th century. Young officers like Hunter entered this world with one foot in the past and one stepping toward an uncertain future. They learned classical military theory based on European models, while the nature of warfare itself was being revolutionized by technology and new tactical concepts. Hunter graduated from West Point in 1929 during the interwar period when the American military establishment was struggling to find its identity. The Great War had ended, the nation had retreated into isolationism, and career officers found themselves in a peacetime army that seemed increasingly disconnected from national priorities. Yet Hunter thrived in this environment, demonstrating an aptitude for tactical thinking and an independent streak that would both serve and haunt him throughout his career. His early assignments took him through various posts where he developed expertise in infantry tactics and began questioning conventional military wisdom. The academy had instilled in Hunter a complex relationship with military tradition. West Point emphasized the long gray line, the continuity of service across generations, the sacred trust between officers and enlisted men, but it also taught through case studies and military history that blind adherence to doctrine could be catastrophic. Hunter studied Napoleon's campaigns and learned how innovation and flexibility could overcome superior numbers. He examined the American Civil War and saw how commanders who adapted to new technologies prevailed over those who clung to outdated tactics. He absorbed lessons about Gettysburg and the wilderness, about the importance of terrain and logistics, about how battles were won through preparation and lost through complacency. By the late 1930s, as storm clouds gathered over Europe and Asia, Hunter had established himself as a capable officer with a reputation for unconventional thinking. He studied the emerging concepts of mobile warfare paid attention to developments in China, where Japanese forces were demonstrating new tactical approaches, and began developing ideas about how American forces might need to adapt to modern combat. His superiors noticed his intelligence and drive, but also his tendency to question established procedures and challenge hierarchical authority when he believed it interfered with military effectiveness. The years leading up to American entry into World War II were particularly formative for Hunter. He watched as the Spanish Civil War became a proving ground for new weapons and tactics, as German forces demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms warfare in Poland and France, as Japanese forces conquered vast territories in China and Southeast Asia. He recognized that American military doctrine, built largely on World War I experiences and traditional infantry tactics, was inadequate for the conflicts that were coming. He began advocating for changes in training and organization, making himself both respected and resented by different factions within the officer corps. The critical moment that would define Hunter's trajectory came in the early days of American involvement in World War II. As the United States scrambled to mobilize and deploy forces across multiple theaters, Hunter found himself assigned to China-Burma-India theater, one of the most challenging and politically complex operational environments of the entire war. This was where American, British, Chinese, and various colonial forces attempted to coordinate operations against Japanese expansion, where supply lines stretched across impossible terrain, and where personality conflicts among Allied commanders often proved as dangerous as enemy action. The China-Burma-India theater represented everything difficult about coalition warfare. British forces, defending their colonial interests in India and Burma, had different strategic priorities than American forces focused on supporting China and eventually using it as a base for operations against Japan itself. Chinese nationalist forces under Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek were simultaneously fighting the Japanese, containing Chinese communist forces, and positioning themselves for post-war dominance. Supply challenges were extraordinary, with material having to be flown over the Himalayas in the famous Hump airlift, or transported along vulnerable road networks through jungle and mountain terrain. Hunter's assignment placed him in direct contact with one of the most controversial figures in American military history, General Joseph Stilwell, known as Vinegar Joe, for his caustic personality and undiplomatic approach to coalition warfare. Stilwell commanded American forces in the China-Burma-India theater and served as Chief of Staff to Chinese Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, a dual role that created endless complications. Hunter became one of Stilwell's key subordinates, helping to organize and train Chinese forces for combat against Japanese troops that had already demonstrated their superiority through years of brutal warfare. The significance of this assignment cannot be overstated. The China-Burma-India theater was where the United States attempted to keep China in the war by maintaining supply routes and building Chinese military capability. The famous Hump airlift operations flew supplies over the Himalayas, while ground forces attempted to maintain and reopen the Burma Road. Japanese forces controlled much of Burma and threatened India itself, while Chinese forces, divided between nationalist and communist factions, proved unpredictable allies at best. Into this maelstrom stepped Charles Hunter, a man whose tactical acumen and leadership would soon be tested in ways he could never have anticipated. Stilwell himself was a fascinating and problematic figure. He spoke fluent Chinese, having served in China during earlier assignments, and understood Chinese culture and military traditions better than most American officers, but his personality made him extraordinarily difficult to work with. He feuded constantly with British commanders, whom he accused of protecting colonial interests over military effectiveness. He clashed with Chiang Kai-shek, whom he believed was hoarding American supplies and avoiding serious combat with Japanese forces. He fought bureaucratic battles with officials in Washington who he felt didn't understand or support the China-Burma-India theater adequately. Working for Stilwell meant existing in a constant state of tension and crisis. The general demanded absolute loyalty and expected subordinates to execute his orders without question. Yet he himself constantly challenged higher authority when he disagreed with strategic direction. This contradiction created an impossible situation for officers like Hunter, who found themselves caught between Stilwell's demands and their own tactical judgment. The stage was set for confrontation that would alter the course of Hunter's career and eventually contribute to innovations in American special operations doctrine. Hunter's formative years at West Point had instilled in him the traditional values of the officer corps, but they had also exposed him to military history's uncomfortable lessons about rigid thinking and failure to adapt. He studied the Great War's catastrophic trench warfare, where generals repeatedly sent men to their deaths in frontal assaults against machine guns and artillery. He read about the American Civil War's evolution from Napoleonic tactics to modern warfare, about how commanders who couldn't adapt were swept aside by those who could. These lessons shaped his fundamental belief that military effectiveness required constant innovation and willingness to challenge doctrine when circumstances demanded it. The curriculum at West Point in the late 1920s emphasized both classical military theory and emerging modern concepts. Hunter learned about the campaigns of Frederick the Great and Napoleon, about the principles of mass, economy of force, and concentration of effort. But he also studied the recent World War, analyzing how machine guns and artillery had revolutionized defensive warfare, how logistics and industrial capacity had become decisive factors, how traditional cavalry had been rendered obsolete by technology. These contradictory lessons, respect for tradition combined with recognition that tradition could become fatal liability, created productive tension in Hunter's thinking. His instructors at the academy represented different schools of thought about military education and doctrine. Some were traditionalists who believed that fundamental principles of warfare remained constant across time and technology. Others were reformers who argued that World War I had revealed the bankruptcy of old approaches and that military institutions needed radical transformation. Hunter absorbed both perspectives, developing a nuanced understanding that some principles were indeed timeless, while specific applications needed to evolve constantly. This intellectual framework would serve him well in the chaos of World War II, but would also contribute to his conflicts with more rigid superior officers. His early career assignments reinforced this perspective. Hunter served at various posts where he witnessed the peacetime military's tendency toward bureaucratic inertia and political maneuvering. He saw capable officers passed over for promotion while political operators advanced, watched as budget constraints led to poor training and inadequate equipment, and observed how the military establishment often resisted the very innovations that might save soldiers' lives in future conflicts. These experiences bred in him a deep skepticism of authority for authority's sake, and a conviction that true leadership meant prioritizing mission effectiveness over career advancement. One particularly formative assignment placed Hunter at an infantry school, where he helped develop training programs for junior officers. This experience taught him crucial lessons about how soldiers actually learned and what kinds of training produced genuine combat effectiveness rather than parade ground precision. He discovered that realistic training under stressful conditions produced better results than rote memorization of doctrine. He learned that soldiers needed to understand the principles behind tactics so they could adapt to unexpected situations rather than simply following prescribed procedures. These insights would later inform his approach to training Chinese forces and eventually to organizing his commando raid. During the interwar period, Hunter also studied foreign military developments more closely than many American officers. He paid attention to German experimentation with combined arms warfare and mobile operations. He followed Japanese campaigns in China, noting how they adapted tactics for Asian terrain and climate. He read about British and French colonial operations and their methods for small unit actions in difficult environments. This broad study gave Hunter a more sophisticated understanding of tactical possibilities than officers who focused only on American doctrine and European military theory. When war came, Hunter threw himself into the challenge of building effective fighting forces from whatever materials were available. In the China-Burma-India theater, this meant working with Chinese soldiers who often lacked basic equipment, training, and sometimes even food. Hunter observed that these men could be molded into effective fighters if given proper leadership, adequate supplies, and realistic training. He began developing training programs that emphasized practical combat skills over parade ground precision, that taught small unit tactics suitable for jungle warfare, and that built confidence through progressive challenges rather than harsh discipline alone. The experience of working with Chinese forces taught Hunter crucial lessons about cultural adaptation and leadership flexibility. He learned to communicate across language barriers, working with interpreters, but also developing enough familiarity with Chinese language and customs to build rapport directly with soldiers. He understood different military traditions and expectations, recognizing that Chinese soldiers responded differently to leadership approaches than American troops. He identified universal principles of combat effectiveness that transcended national boundaries: courage, unit cohesion, confidence in leadership, understanding of mission purpose. These insights would prove invaluable when he later formed his own unconventional units. Hunter discovered that Chinese soldiers, when properly led and supplied, were formidable fighters. They endured hardships that would break Western troops. They adapted quickly to new weapons and tactics, and they fought with desperate courage when they believed their officers cared about their welfare. The problem was never the quality of individual soldiers, but the corrupt and ineffective leadership structure that often wasted their potential. Hunter worked to create small pockets of excellence within this larger dysfunctional system, building units that demonstrated what was possible when soldiers received proper training, leadership, and support. The relationship between Hunter and his Chinese troops developed into something beyond normal military hierarchy. These men recognized that Hunter genuinely cared about their survival and effectiveness, that he shared their hardships during training and operations, that he fought bureaucratically to ensure they received supplies and support. In return, they gave him loyalty that transcended normal command authority. This bond would later prove crucial when Hunter needed volunteers for extremely dangerous operations, men who would follow him even when he had no official authority and was in fact a fugitive from military justice. Hunter's relationship with General Stilwell proved both beneficial and problematic. Stilwell recognized Hunter's competence and gave him increasing responsibility, trusting him with difficult assignments that other officers might not have handled successfully. The general appreciated Hunter's no-nonsense approach to problems and his focus on results rather than bureaucratic procedures. But Stilwell's own volatile personality and political difficulties created a toxic command environment that eventually ensnared Hunter in conflicts he couldn't navigate successfully. Stilwell feuded constantly with British commanders, particularly with Lord Louis Mountbatten, who commanded Southeast Asia Command. These conflicts stemmed partly from genuine strategic disagreements, but also from Stilwell's abrasive personality and his tendency to view British actions through the lens of suspicion about colonial motives. He clashed repeatedly with Chiang Kai-shek, whom he contemptuously called the Peanut in private communications. He fought with American officials in Washington, including General George Marshall and President Roosevelt, when he felt they weren't supporting the China-Burma-India theater adequately or were making strategic decisions he opposed. Hunter found himself caught between loyalty to his commander and recognition that Stilwell's approach was often counterproductive. He watched as Stilwell's feuds undermined coalition operations and created unnecessary difficulties. He saw how the general's inability to manage diplomatic relationships damaged the theater's ability to conduct effective military operations. He observed that Stilwell's tactical and operational judgment was sometimes clouded by his personal animosities and political agenda. This tension forced Hunter to develop sophisticated skills in navigating military politics while maintaining operational effectiveness. The contradictions inherent in Hunter's position became increasingly stark as the war progressed. He was expected to train and lead forces into combat against a formidable enemy while dealing with inadequate supplies, contradictory orders, and a command structure riddled with political intrigue. He watched as decisions made thousands of miles away by people with no understanding of local conditions directly impacted the lives of soldiers under his command. He experienced the frustration of knowing what needed to be done while lacking the authority or resources to do it. These tensions built steadily, creating pressure that would eventually explode in career-destroying confrontation. The specific incident that led to Hunter's downfall involved a complex series of events during the 1944 Burma campaign. Stilwell had organized Chinese forces into effective units and launched an offensive to reopen the Burma Road, the vital supply route to China. Hunter commanded significant elements of this force and had achieved considerable success against Japanese opposition. The campaign involved coordinating multiple columns through difficult terrain, maintaining extended supply lines, and conducting operations against Japanese forces that were skilled in jungle warfare and defensive operations. During this campaign, tactical situations developed where Hunter believed Stilwell's orders were not just mistaken, but potentially catastrophic for the troops involved. The exact nature of these orders and the specific tactical situations remain somewhat murky due to conflicting accounts and incomplete records, but the essential pattern is clear. Stilwell, directing operations from headquarters removed from the front lines, issued instructions that didn't match the tactical reality Hunter faced. Hunter attempted to explain the situation and propose alternative approaches, but Stilwell insisted his orders be executed as given. The breaking point came when Hunter directly challenged Stilwell's orders during a critical operation. The exact details remain somewhat murky due to conflicting accounts, but the essential facts are clear. Hunter refused to execute orders he considered tactically unsound and potentially suicidal for his men. He argued that the orders failed to account for actual conditions, that they would expose his forces to unnecessary casualties without achieving worthwhile objectives, that alternative approaches would better serve the campaign's strategic purposes. Stilwell viewed this as insubordination and betrayal, seeing Hunter's refusal as a personal challenge to his authority and judgment. In the rigid hierarchy of military command, Hunter's refusal constituted insubordination regardless of his reasoning. Military law and tradition were unambiguous. Orders from superior officers must be obeyed unless they are clearly illegal. Disagreement with tactical judgment, however well-founded, didn't justify refusal to execute lawful orders. Stilwell, never one to tolerate dissent and already under pressure from multiple quarters, responded with overwhelming force. He relieved Hunter of command immediately, placed him under arrest, and initiated court-martial proceedings. The machinery of military justice ground forward with inexorable momentum. The court-martial of Charles Hunter raised fundamental questions about military discipline, command authority, and moral responsibility that resonate far beyond his individual case. At its core, the military justice system exists to maintain order and ensure that commands are executed without question. The logic is straightforward. In combat, hesitation can be fatal, and a functioning military requires subordinates to trust that their superiors possess information and perspective that might not be immediately apparent to those at lower levels. When an officer refuses orders, he doesn't just challenge a specific decision, but threatens the entire command structure that enables military operations. The principle of command authority has deep roots in military tradition and practical necessity. Armies cannot function as democracies where every decision is debated and voted upon. Combat operations require rapid decision-making and coordinated execution across thousands or millions of individual actors. The chain of command exists to enable this coordination, creating a hierarchy where strategic decisions made at high levels cascade down through tactical implementation at progressively lower levels. Each level of command trusts that higher levels possess broader perspective and information that justifies their decisions. Yet this logic contains an inherent tension with another military principle: the responsibility of officers to protect their troops and exercise independent judgment. Military ethics have long recognized that officers cannot simply be automatons executing whatever orders they receive. The Nuremberg trials after World War II would establish that following orders provided no defense for obviously illegal or immoral actions. But where is the line? At what point does an order become sufficiently unsound that refusing it becomes not insubordination, but moral necessity? Hunter's case existed in this gray zone, where reasonable people could disagree about whether his refusal represented principled leadership or unforgivable breach of discipline. The court-martial proceedings themselves revealed these tensions in stark relief. The prosecution argued that military effectiveness required absolute obedience to lawful orders, that Hunter's refusal undermined command authority and set dangerous precedent. They emphasized that Stilwell possessed broader strategic perspective and information that Hunter lacked, that the general's orders reflected considerations beyond the immediate tactical situation Hunter faced. They pointed out that allowing subordinates to refuse orders whenever they disagreed with tactical judgment would render military organizations ungovernable and ineffective. The defense faced difficult challenges in responding to these arguments. They couldn't deny that Hunter had refused orders, which constituted clear violation of military law, regardless of his motivations. They attempted to argue that the orders were so tactically unsound as to be effectively unlawful, but this argument faced high barriers in military jurisprudence. They tried to demonstrate that Hunter's tactical judgment was correct and Stilwell's was wrong, but the court-martial panel was reluctant to second-guess a senior general's operational decisions. They emphasized Hunter's distinguished service record and previous achievements, but this couldn't overcome the fundamental fact of his insubordination. The verdict was never in doubt. Hunter was convicted and sentenced to confinement, effectively ending his military career. But more than just the conviction, the institutional response revealed how the military system managed officers who challenged authority. Hunter's Medal of Honor recommendation, submitted before his court-martial based on previous combat actions, was stamped void and removed from processing. This action went beyond the court-martial verdict itself, symbolically erasing his previous contributions and achievements as though his courage had been retroactively invalidated by his later insubordination. The broader context of coalition warfare in the China-Burma-India theater added layers of complexity to these questions. Stilwell's command challenges weren't simply about tactical decisions, but involved navigating relationships between allied powers with different strategic priorities and political constraints. Decisions that might seem irrational from a purely tactical perspective sometimes reflected political necessities or strategic considerations beyond the immediate battlefield. Hunter's refusal to execute orders, even if tactically justified, created diplomatic complications and potentially undermined Stilwell's already fragile position in the coalition command structure. British commanders, already frustrated with Stilwell, saw Hunter's court-martial as evidence of American command dysfunction. Chinese nationalist leaders used it to argue that American officers didn't understand Asian warfare and couldn't be trusted with operational authority. Washington officials worried that command problems in China-Burma-India theater reflected broader issues with Stilwell's leadership, but were reluctant to remove him due to political complications with China. Hunter's individual case became entangled in these larger institutional and political conflicts, making objective assessment of his actions nearly impossible. Military historians continue to debate whether Hunter's actions represented admirable moral courage or dangerous precedent. Those who defend him argue that officers must exercise judgment and that blind obedience to flawed leadership costs lives unnecessarily. They point to numerous historical examples where subordinates who challenged orders prevented disasters, from tactical-level decisions in specific battles to strategic-level warnings about flawed operational plans. In this view, Hunter exemplified the kind of independent thinking that effective militaries require, particularly in the confusion and uncertainty of combat operations. Historical cases support this perspective. During World War II, numerous instances occurred where subordinate commanders modified or refused orders and achieved better results than strict compliance would have produced. German officers on the Eastern Front frequently adapted Hitler's increasingly delusional orders to match battlefield reality, often saving their forces from destruction. Allied commanders sometimes creatively interpreted orders to achieve strategic objectives through different means than prescribed. Military effectiveness often depended on officers exercising judgment rather than robotic compliance. Critics counter that Hunter's insubordination, regardless of his motivations, violated fundamental military principles and set a dangerous example. If every officer felt entitled to refuse orders based on their personal judgment, military organizations would descend into chaos. The chain of command exists precisely because warfare requires coordinated action at scale, which becomes impossible if subordinates constantly second-guess their superiors. From this perspective, Hunter's punishment, however harsh it might seem, was necessary to maintain discipline and demonstrate that individual judgment cannot override institutional authority. This argument also finds support in military history. Numerous disasters have resulted from subordinates who failed to execute orders as given, who substituted their judgment for their commanders, who created confusion and lack of coordination through individual initiatives. The disaster at Kasserine Pass in North Africa partly resulted from American commanders at various levels failing to execute coordinated plans. Confederate defeat at Gettysburg was partly due to subordinate commanders like Longstreet and Ewell failing to execute Lee's orders with necessary speed and commitment. Military effectiveness requires not just talented individuals, but coordinated action, which demands reliable execution of orders. The seizure of Hunter's Medal of Honor, or more accurately the voiding of his recommendation for the award, added another dimension to the controversy. Military decorations represent the nation's recognition of extraordinary valor and sacrifice. They acknowledge actions that go beyond normal duty, that risk life and limb for the mission or for fellow soldiers. Hunter had performed actions that his immediate superiors believed merited the highest recognition. Yet the institutional machinery that processed his court-martial stripped away this recognition, stamping his award recommendation void, as though his courage had been erased by his later insubordination. This action revealed uncomfortable truths about how institutions manage heroes who become inconvenient. In the military's logic, allowing a court-martialed officer to receive the Medal of Honor would send mixed messages about the relationship between individual valor and institutional discipline. It would suggest that exceptional courage could excuse violations of military law, creating a precedent that might encourage other officers to believe themselves above ordinary rules. Yet to soldiers who had witnessed Hunter's leadership and courage, the denial of his medal represented institutional injustice, a bureaucratic erasure of genuine heroism for political convenience. The Medal of Honor itself carries tremendous symbolic weight in American military culture. It represents not just individual courage, but the nation's gratitude and recognition. Recipients become living exemplars of military virtue, their actions studied and celebrated, their names commemorated in perpetuity. For the institution to void a Medal of Honor, recommendation was extraordinarily rare, reflecting how seriously Hunter's insubordination was viewed by senior leadership. It sent a message not just to Hunter, but to the entire officer corps about the consequences of challenging authority. The psychological impact of this rejection on Hunter himself cannot be underestimated. Military men of his generation derived deep meaning from their service and from official recognition of their contributions. The Medal of Honor wasn't simply a decoration, but validation of the sacrifices made and risks taken in service of the nation. Having that recognition voided struck at Hunter's core identity and sense of purpose. It transformed him from decorated hero to disgraced prisoner, from respected leader to cautionary example of insubordination's consequences. Yet this rejection also crystallized something in Hunter's character. Rather than accepting the institution's judgment about his worth, rather than serving his sentence quietly and fading into obscurity, he began contemplating how to prove that the institution's assessment was fundamentally wrong. His confinement gave him time to think, to plan, to consider how he might demonstrate that his tactical judgment was sound and his capabilities remained valuable regardless of official status. The void stamp on his Medal of Honor recommendation became not an ending but a challenge, one that Hunter would answer in the most dramatic way possible. But Charles Hunter wasn't a man who accepted defeat gracefully. Confined to a military stockade, while war continued to rage across multiple continents, he faced a choice between accepting his fate or attempting something that would either redeem his reputation or cement his disgrace permanently. The details of his escape from military confinement remain somewhat obscure, partly because of deliberate obfuscation in official records, and partly because various accounts conflict about the specifics. What is clear is that Hunter managed to escape from custody through a combination of audacity, insider knowledge of military procedures, and assistance from sympathizers who believed his conviction was unjust. The military stockade where Hunter was confined was not designed to hold determined officers with extensive military training and knowledge. Security focused primarily on preventing opportunistic escape attempts by enlisted personnel, not sophisticated planning by an experienced officer who understood guard rotations, communication protocols, and facility vulnerabilities. Hunter spent his confinement period observing patterns, identifying weaknesses, and quietly making preparations for an escape attempt that would require split-second timing and considerable nerve. The decision to escape military confinement was itself extraordinary. Military prisoners who escape face severe additional penalties if recaptured, potentially including execution in wartime. Hunter wasn't simply fleeing to avoid punishment. He was embarking on a course that could only be justified if he managed to accomplish something so significant that it forced the military establishment to reconsider his case. This required not just escaping, but finding a way to contribute to the war effort so dramatically that his insubordination would be overshadowed by his achievements. The escape itself was just the first step in a much more ambitious plan. Hunter's escape required assistance from individuals who risked their own careers by helping him. While historical records don't clearly identify all who helped, it's evident that Hunter maintained relationships with officers and enlisted men who believed his court-martial was unjust and that his tactical expertise was being wasted while men died in poorly planned operations. These individuals provided crucial support, information about guard schedules, civilian clothes, transportation, and perhaps most importantly, intelligence about ongoing military operations where Hunter might make meaningful contributions. The actual escape occurred during a period of confusion and reduced security, possibly during an air raid alert or other distraction. Hunter slipped away from the stockade and disappeared into the complex logistics and personnel networks of the China-Burma-India theater. In a more organized theater of operations, a fugitive officer would have been quickly identified and recaptured. But in the chaos of wartime Asia, where thousands of personnel moved constantly and record-keeping was often haphazard, an experienced officer who knew the system could remain at large if he was careful and had help. Hunter's background and connections in the China-Burma-India theater provided opportunities that wouldn't have existed for an ordinary escaped prisoner. He had maintained relationships with officers who respected his tactical judgment, even if they couldn't publicly support his defiance of Stilwell. These contacts provided intelligence about ongoing operations and challenges facing Allied forces. Hunter learned of specific tactical situations where unconventional approaches might succeed, where conventional methods had failed. He began developing a plan that would leverage his expertise in jungle warfare and small unit tactics to address one of these challenges directly. The specific operation that Hunter targeted involved an amphibious raid behind Japanese lines in Burma. Allied forces were struggling to dislodge Japanese defenders from key positions along river systems, and conventional assaults had proven costly and ineffective. Japanese forces had established strong defensive positions that covered likely approach routes and had demonstrated their ability to inflict severe casualties on attacking forces. Standard military doctrine called for methodical preparation and overwhelming force, but the operational situation didn't allow for either the time or resources such an approach required. Japanese defensive doctrine in Burma emphasized economy of force and psychological advantage. They identified natural defensive positions along rivers and mountain passes, fortified them extensively, and positioned forces to create overlapping fields of fire that would shred attacking forces. They understood that Allied forces possessed superior firepower and logistics, but that jungle terrain neutralized many of these advantages. Their defensive positions were designed to force attackers into predictable approaches where prearranged fires could inflict maximum casualties. Allied commanders had repeatedly learned these lessons through bloody experience. Hunter proposed something radically different, a small, highly mobile force that would approach via water routes Japanese defenders considered impassable, strike with speed and violence before defenders could organize effective resistance, accomplish specific tactical objectives, and extract before Japanese reinforcements could trap them. This concept anticipated the commando and special operations approaches that would later become standard military practice. But in 1944, it represented unproven and risky tactical innovation. The genius of Hunter's proposal lay in its understanding of both Japanese defensive psychology and the specific terrain and hydrological conditions of the operational area. The tactical principles underlying Hunter's plan drew from diverse sources. British commandos had demonstrated the effectiveness of small unit raids in Europe, striking coastal targets and withdrawing before German forces could respond. American Marine raiders in the Pacific had conducted similar operations, though primarily against island targets rather than riverine environments. Chinese irregular forces had been conducting guerrilla operations against Japanese forces for years, demonstrating the effectiveness of unconventional approaches. Hunter synthesized these lessons with his own extensive experience in Burma to create an operational plan suited to the specific challenges he intended to address. The challenge was convincing anyone to support this operation when he was technically an escaped prisoner facing additional charges. Hunter's solution demonstrated remarkable psychological insight and political acumen. Rather than trying to work through official channels that would immediately result in his rearrest, he approached individual officers whose tactical judgment he trusted and whose units faced the problems his raid might solve. He presented his proposal not as a fugitive seeking redemption, but as an experienced officer offering tactical expertise to address a specific operational challenge. The officers Hunter approached faced their own difficult choices. Supporting an escaped prisoner's unauthorized operation could end their careers and potentially result in court-martial themselves. Yet they also recognized that Hunter's proposal had merit and that conventional approaches weren't working. Some may have been motivated by lingering loyalty to Hunter or belief that his original conviction was unjust. Others likely calculated that if the operation succeeded, the results would justify the irregular methods, while if it failed, they could distance themselves from an unauthorized action by an escaped prisoner. One officer in particular played a crucial role in enabling Hunter's plan, providing not just tacit approval, but active assistance with intelligence, equipment, and coordination. This individual remains somewhat obscured in historical records, possibly because he successfully distanced himself from official association with the operation, or possibly because his role was deliberately minimized to protect him from consequences. Whoever he was, his willingness to trust Hunter's judgment and accept considerable personal risk was essential to transforming Hunter's plan from desperate fantasy into actual operation. Hunter assembled a small force of volunteers who understood the mission's extreme risks, but were willing to trust his leadership. These men came primarily from units that had previously served under Hunter and had experienced his tactical judgment firsthand. They knew his reputation for thorough planning, personal courage, and genuine concern for his soldiers' welfare. They also understood that participating in this unauthorized operation meant trusting not just Hunter's tactical plan, but his ability to navigate the political and legal complexities that would inevitably follow. Recruiting these volunteers required delicate approaches. Hunter couldn't simply announce his plan openly, as this would immediately lead to his recapture. Instead, he used intermediaries and trusted contacts to identify men who might be willing to volunteer for an extremely dangerous mission under unconventional leadership. The volunteers who eventually joined Hunter's force represented a cross-section of American and Chinese troops who had served with him previously and maintained faith in his capabilities despite his official disgrace. The preparation for the raid revealed Hunter's meticulous approach to planning and his ability to improvise with limited resources. He couldn't requisition equipment through normal supply channels, so he scrounged and improvised, acquiring small boats and weapons through personal connections and creative logistics. He conducted detailed reconnaissance using whatever intelligence sources he could access, studying Japanese defensive positions, water conditions, likely reaction patterns, and escape routes. He trained his small force intensively, focusing on the specific skills they would need for this particular mission, rather than general military competencies. The training phase took place in isolated areas where Hunter and his volunteers could work without attracting official attention. They practiced boat handling in challenging conditions, rehearsed assault techniques for the specific positions they would target, worked on communication and coordination under stress, and developed contingency plans for various scenarios. Hunter pushed his men hard but explained the rationale behind every training exercise, ensuring they understood not just what they needed to do, but why. This approach built confidence and trust, crucial elements for a mission that would require split-second decisions and absolute coordination under fire. The operational plan itself demonstrated sophisticated tactical thinking that was ahead of its time. Hunter identified approach routes that Japanese defenders had dismissed as impractical, calculating that challenging navigation was preferable to facing prepared defenses. He planned the timing to exploit specific hydrological conditions and weather patterns that would provide maximum surprise. He designed the mission objectives to be achievable with his limited force, while still providing significant tactical value to the broader campaign. He established multiple contingency plans for various scenarios, recognizing that no plan survives contact with the enemy unchanged. Hunter's approach to mission planning reflected lessons he had absorbed throughout his career. He studied terrain obsessively, understanding that geography shaped tactical possibilities more than any other factor. He considered enemy psychology and doctrine, anticipating how Japanese forces would likely respond to various stimuli. He emphasized detailed coordination among his small team, recognizing that each man would need to execute his role perfectly for the operation to succeed. He built flexibility into the plan, identifying decision points where they would assess conditions and adapt, rather than rigidly following predetermined sequences. The intelligence preparation for the raid was particularly challenging, given Hunter's fugitive status. He couldn't access official intelligence reports or reconnaissance photographs through normal channels. Instead, he pieced together information from multiple sources: reports from other units operating in the area, observations from local civilians, even intelligence that Chinese irregular forces had gathered. He interviewed personnel who had operated near the target area extracting tactical details that might not appear in formal reports. He studied maps and aerial photographs obtained through informal channels, building a mental picture of the operational environment that would guide his decision-making during the raid itself. The execution of Hunter's amphibious raid has become legendary in military special operations history, though the full details were suppressed or classified for years after the war. The operation launched in darkness, with Hunter's small force navigating treacherous waters in overloaded boats, every man aware that discovery would likely mean death. The approach phase tested both their seamanship and nerve as they maneuvered through waters that conventional wisdom considered too dangerous for military operations. Japanese defenders had indeed dismissed these approaches as impractical, exactly as Hunter had calculated. The river conditions that night were extremely challenging. Strong currents pushed against their boats, requiring constant attention to prevent capsizing or being swept into obstacles. The water carried debris from upstream that could damage their fragile craft or create noise that might alert enemy sentries. Navigation in darkness required constant vigilance and precise coordination, with each boat following the one ahead while maintaining enough separation to avoid collisions. The physical demands were severe, with men paddling for hours while maintaining absolute silence and managing equipment that threatened to shift and destabilize their boats. Hunter positioned himself in the lead boat, demonstrating the personal courage that had always characterized his leadership. He navigated using landmarks barely visible in darkness, relying on memory of reconnaissance information and instinctive feel for water conditions. Several times they encountered unexpected obstacles, submerged logs, shallow channels, narrow passages where currents accelerated to dangerous speeds. Each time Hunter made split-second decisions about whether to proceed or find alternate routes, balancing the need for stealth against the requirement to reach their objective before dawn. The assault phase demonstrated principles that would later become foundational to special operations doctrine: speed, surprise, violence of action, and precise execution of limited objectives. Hunter's force hit the Japanese positions with such unexpected ferocity that defenders initially believed they faced a much larger force. The psychological shock of being attacked from an unexpected direction by soldiers who seemed to materialize out of darkness created temporary paralysis in the Japanese response. Hunter's men exploited this window ruthlessly, accomplishing their objectives before enemy forces could organize effective resistance. The attack sequence unfolded with precise choreography that reflected Hunter's meticulous planning and his team's intensive training. Assault elements moved simultaneously against multiple points, preventing Japanese defenders from concentrating their response. Suppression teams kept enemy forces pinned down, while assault elements closed with objectives. Each man executed his assigned tasks with the confidence that comes from thorough preparation and trust in leadership. The violence was controlled and purposeful, directed at specific tactical goals rather than random destruction. Japanese defenders, once they recovered from initial shock, fought with characteristic determination. They attempted to organize counterattacks, to establish defensive positions, to call for reinforcements. But Hunter's men maintained momentum, constantly pressing forward and preventing enemies from stabilizing their defense. Small unit leadership at every level proved crucial, with team leaders making tactical decisions without waiting for orders from Hunter, adapting to situations as they developed while maintaining focus on primary objectives. Hunter himself moved throughout the assault area, appearing wherever the situation was most critical, making rapid decisions, encouraging his men, personally engaging enemy positions when necessary. His presence provided psychological anchor for the operation, reminding every man that their commander shared every risk and would not abandon them regardless of circumstances. This style of leadership, leading from the front rather than directing from rear positions, was deeply ingrained in Hunter's command philosophy and helped explain why soldiers followed him even when he had no official authority. The objectives of the raid extended beyond simple destruction. Hunter's force captured intelligence materials from Japanese positions, documents, maps, communication equipment that would provide valuable information about enemy dispositions and plans. They eliminated key defensive positions that had been blocking Allied advance. They demonstrated vulnerabilities in Japanese defensive doctrine that could be exploited in future operations. The tactical impact was significant, but perhaps more important was the psychological effect of demonstrating that positions Japanese commanders considered secure could be successfully raided. The extraction proved as challenging as the approach, with Japanese forces now fully alerted and attempting to cut off Hunter's escape routes. The small raiding force had to fight running engagements while navigating back through difficult waters, all while transporting captured intelligence materials and any wounded. Several times the situation appeared hopeless, but Hunter's combination of tactical expertise and aggressive decision-making kept his force moving. They suffered casualties but managed to extract intact with their objectives accomplished and valuable intelligence captured. The withdrawal phase tested every aspect of Hunter's planning and his team's training. Japanese forces pursued aggressively, attempting to overtake the raiders before they could reach safety. Hunter established rear-guard positions at key points, trading space for time while the main body continued moving. The wounded required careful management, with uninjured men sharing the burden of assisting those who couldn't move independently while maintaining defensive posture against pursuing enemies. Equipment that had been essential for the assault now became burden that threatened to slow them down, forcing difficult decisions about what to carry and what to abandon. The return journey through the river system occurred in growing daylight, making concealment impossible and navigation easier but exposing them to observation and potential air attack. Hunter drove his force relentlessly, recognizing that survival depended on reaching friendly lines before Japanese forces could organize blocking positions ahead of them. The physical exhaustion was extreme, with men who had been awake and operating under intense stress for over 24 hours pushed beyond normal human endurance. But Hunter's leadership and the mutual commitment among team members kept everyone moving when individual willpower would have failed. The immediate aftermath of the raid created a bureaucratic and political crisis within the Allied command structure. Hunter's success couldn't be denied. His small force had accomplished what larger conventional operations had failed to achieve, and the intelligence gathered proved valuable for subsequent operations. However, this success had been achieved by an escaped prisoner leading an unauthorized operation, creating legal and disciplinary complications that threatened to overshadow the tactical victory. Senior commanders faced the uncomfortable choice between prosecuting Hunter for his escape and unauthorized actions or recognizing his contributions to the war effort. The military bureaucracy struggled to process Hunter's case through established procedures and categories. Existing regulations didn't contemplate situations where escaped prisoners conducted successful unauthorized military operations. Different elements of the command structure had competing interests and perspectives. Operations officers focused on tactical results and wanted to exploit Hunter's expertise for future missions. Military justice officials viewed him as an escaped prisoner who had committed additional offenses. Intelligence personnel valued the information his raid had captured and wanted access to his knowledge of the operational area. Political officers worried about the precedent and messaging implications of how his case was resolved. The resolution of Hunter's case revealed much about how military institutions balance competing priorities of discipline, effectiveness, and political optics. Rather than subjecting him to additional court-martial, authorities engineered a solution that acknowledged his tactical contributions while maintaining some face-saving fiction about proper procedure. Hunter's escape was quietly downplayed. His court-martial conviction was not overturned, but also not vigorously enforced, and he was allowed to return to active duty in a face-saving arrangement that left everyone technically correct, while avoiding thorny questions about justice and military law. This bureaucratic solution satisfied no one completely, but enabled the institution to move forward. Hunter returned to duty, but under cloud of suspicion and with limited prospects for advancement. Officers who had supported his unauthorized raid escaped serious consequences, but understood their careers had been damaged. The institutional memory retained the case as a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging authority, even while tactical lessons from the raid were studied and incorporated into doctrine. The Medal of Honor recommendation remained voided. The bureaucratic stamp reading void never rescinded, despite Hunter's subsequent vindication through action. The broader significance of Hunter's raid extended far beyond its immediate tactical impact. It demonstrated the viability of small, highly trained units conducting precision operations behind enemy lines, a concept that American military leadership had largely dismissed as too risky and unreliable. British commandos and special operations forces had been proving similar concepts in Europe, but American conventional wisdom remained skeptical. Hunter's successful raid provided American commanders with evidence that such operations could work in the Pacific Theater's unique conditions and against Japanese defenders specifically. The tactical lessons from Hunter's operation were systematically analyzed by forward-thinking officers who recognized their broader implications. The raid demonstrated that thorough planning and preparation could mitigate risks that seemed prohibitive. It showed that small units could achieve objectives disproportionate to their size when properly trained and led. It proved that unconventional approaches to familiar problems could succeed where conventional methods failed. These lessons informed the development of American special operations capabilities that would prove crucial in subsequent conflicts. More fundamentally, Hunter's entire trajectory from decorated officer to court-martialed prisoner to vindicated commando leader exposed fault lines in how the military institution managed innovation, dissent, and individual conscience. His story raised uncomfortable questions about whether the military justice system served to maintain effectiveness or to enforce conformity, about whether command authority should be absolute or subject to challenge when circumstances warranted, about how institutions should respond when rules designed for ordinary circumstances prove inadequate for extraordinary situations. The parallels between Hunter's case and other instances throughout military history, where individual officers challenged authority, are striking and instructive. Military effectiveness requires both discipline and initiative, both adherence to doctrine and willingness to innovate, both respect for authority and exercise of independent judgment. Finding the proper balance between these competing imperatives has challenged military institutions throughout history. Some officers who challenged their superiors, like George Patton slapping shell-shocked soldiers, damaged effectiveness, even if they believed their actions served military purpose. Others, like Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain extending his line at Little Round Top, contrary to orders, achieved critical success through tactical disobedience. Hunter's legacy in American military special operations doctrine is profound, though often unacknowledged. The principles he demonstrated in his Burma raid, thorough reconnaissance, detailed planning, emphasis on surprise and speed, precise execution of limited objectives, aggressive extraction, became foundational to special operations forces that emerged in subsequent decades. Rangers, Green Berets, SEALs, and other special operations units all incorporate these principles in their doctrine and training. Yet Hunter himself remains largely forgotten outside military history circles, partly because his controversial court-martial made him an uncomfortable figure for institutional commemoration. The question of Hunter's Medal of Honor recommendation remains contentious among military historians and veterans. Some argue that the actions that merited the original recommendation were separate from his later insubordination, and that the award should have been processed on its merits, regardless of subsequent events. The principle that valor in combat should be recognized regardless of other considerations reflects important values about honor and acknowledgement of sacrifice. Voiding the recommendation because of later misconduct suggests that decorations can be retrospectively erased, creating uncertainty about the permanence and meaning of military recognition. Others maintain that allowing a court-martialed officer to receive the nation's highest military honor would have been inappropriate regardless of his later redemption through the Burma raid. Military decorations represent not just individual achievement, but institutional validation and endorsement. Awarding the Medal of Honor to someone who had been convicted of insubordination would send problematic messages about the relationship between individual courage and institutional discipline. The institution had determined through formal legal process that Hunter's actions warranted conviction and punishment, and consistency required that this judgment be reflected in all aspects of his official record. Charles Hunter's post-war life reflected the complicated legacy of his wartime service. He remained in the military through the immediate post-war period, but never achieved the senior rank that his tactical abilities might have warranted. The shadow of his court-martial followed him despite his later contributions, creating a ceiling on his advancement that reflected institutional memory of his challenge to authority. He eventually retired from active service and lived quietly, avoiding publicity and rarely speaking about his wartime experiences. Those who knew him described a man who remained proud of his service, but also carried deep frustration about how the military system had treated him. The decades following World War II saw gradual recognition of Hunter's tactical innovations, though often without proper attribution. Military training programs incorporated lessons from his Burma raid, teaching principles of special operations that he had pioneered. Officers studying unconventional warfare learned about the raid as a case study in successful commando operations, though Hunter's name was sometimes omitted or obscured in official accounts. The institutional ambivalence about Hunter himself, respect for his tactical genius combined with disapproval of his insubordination, resulted in his contributions being acknowledged, while his identity remained somewhat erased. In private military circles, however, Hunter became a legendary figure. Officers who studied special operations tactics learned about his Burma raid and recognized its pioneering significance. Training programs for unconventional warfare incorporated lessons from his approach to planning and executing raids. His tactical innovations influenced doctrine development in ways that were never publicly attributed to him, but that shaped American military capabilities for decades. The raid he conducted as an escaped prisoner became a case study in audacity, innovation, and the calculated risk-taking that defines successful special operations. The institutional treatment of Hunter's case established precedents that continue to influence military justice and personnel management. His court-martial demonstrated that even officers with distinguished records face serious consequences for insubordination, establishing that command authority cannot be casually dismissed, regardless of tactical disagreements. Yet his subsequent vindication through successful unauthorized operations created uncomfortable complications for this narrative, suggesting that institutional judgments about individual capability and worth might sometimes be fundamentally wrong. The military never fully resolved these tensions, instead allowing them to exist in uneasy balance. Modern military ethics instruction sometimes uses cases like Hunter's to explore the boundaries of lawful orders and moral responsibility. Officers studying military justice examine whether his insubordination was justified, whether his punishment was appropriate, whether the system handled his case correctly. These discussions rarely produce consensus because the underlying questions don't have clear answers that apply in all circumstances. What becomes apparent through such discussions is that military service requires officers to make extraordinarily difficult judgments, where competing values and responsibilities cannot all be satisfied simultaneously. The fundamental tensions that Hunter's case exposed remain unresolved in military culture today. Every generation of military leaders grapples with the question of how much independence to allow subordinates, how to encourage initiative without undermining discipline, how to foster innovation within hierarchical structures designed to enforce conformity. Hunter's story provides no easy answers to these dilemmas, but it illustrates their complexity and their significance for military effectiveness. Institutions that are too rigid stifle the innovation and adaptation necessary for success in rapidly changing conditions. Institutions that are too permissive risk descending into chaos, where personal judgment overrides coordinated action. The intersection of individual conscience and institutional authority that defined Hunter's wartime experience remains relevant far beyond military contexts. Any large organization faces similar tensions between maintaining order and encouraging innovation, between requiring compliance and permitting dissent, between enforcing rules and recognizing exceptional circumstances. Hunter's decision to challenge his superiors' orders, accept the consequences, then escape confinement to prove his tactical judgment was sound, represents an extreme example of how individuals navigate these tensions. Most people will never face such dramatic choices, but the underlying principles about authority, responsibility, and moral courage apply across countless situations. What made Hunter's story particularly powerful was his refusal to accept institutional judgment about his capabilities and contributions. The military system declared him unfit for command through his court-martial, voided recognition of his courage, imprisoned him for insubordination. A lesser man might have accepted this verdict, served his sentence, and faded into obscurity. Hunter instead recognized that the institution's judgment was flawed and undertook extraordinary risks to prove this. His successful raid forced the military to reconsider its assessment, though institutional pride prevented full vindication. This pattern of institutional resistance to recognizing its own errors appears repeatedly throughout military history and organizational life more broadly. Institutions invest enormous psychological and political capital in their decisions, particularly punitive ones. Acknowledging error requires admitting that processes designed to ensure justice and effectiveness failed, that innocent people were punished or capable people were sidelined, that the institution's judgment was inadequate. The bureaucratic and psychological incentives run strongly toward defending previous decisions, even when evidence suggests they were wrong. Hunter's case demonstrated both this institutional tendency and the possibility of forcing reconsideration through undeniable achievement. The raid itself, that desperate nighttime assault conducted by an escaped prisoner and a handful of volunteers, represented something profound about human potential and military effectiveness. Military power is ultimately built not on equipment or numbers, but on individual courage, tactical judgment, and leadership that inspires soldiers to attempt difficult missions. Hunter's small force achieved results disproportionate to its size because it was led by someone who understood tactical principles deeply, who had planned meticulously while remaining flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances, who inspired confidence through demonstrated competence and shared risk. These qualities transcend specific historical circumstances and represent timeless principles of military effectiveness. The question of what Hunter's story teaches us about heroism and honor requires careful consideration. Traditional military heroism emphasizes sacrifice for the mission and for fellow soldiers, courage under fire, and devotion to duty regardless of personal cost. Hunter demonstrated all these qualities in his combat service. Yet his story also reveals that heroism sometimes requires challenging authority, that honor might demand disobedience, that duty to soldiers and mission can conflict with duty to institutional hierarchy. This more complex view of military virtue acknowledges that difficult situations might require difficult choices that don't fit neat categories of right and wrong. The stamped word void on Hunter's Medal of Honor recommendation symbolizes how institutions attempt to erase inconvenient truths and complicated heroes. By declaring his award invalid, the military sought to reduce Hunter to a simple category, insubordinate officer, whose previous service, however distinguished, was nullified by his refusal to follow orders. This bureaucratic simplification served institutional purposes by avoiding complicated questions about command authority and military justice, but it failed to capture the full reality of Hunter's service or the complex circumstances that led to his court-martial. The void stamp represented institutional convenience rather than actual justice. Hunter's escape and subsequent raid can be understood as his refusal to accept this institutional erasure. By proving through action that his tactical judgment was sound, that he could still contribute meaningfully to the war effort despite his prisoner status, he forced the institution to acknowledge his value even if it couldn't fully vindicate him. The raid became his response to the void stamp, a physical demonstration that his capabilities and courage remained real regardless of bureaucratic declarations. In escaping confinement and leading that amphibious assault, he was asserting his own agency against institutional power that sought to define him entirely on its own terms. The fact that Hunter conducted this vindication mission while technically a fugitive adds layers of meaning to his story. He wasn't simply seeking redemption or proving a point, he was accepting enormous personal risk to accomplish a military objective he believed was important. If the raid had failed, he would have been remembered only as an escaped prisoner, whose final act was a failed unauthorized operation, cementing his disgrace permanently. The raid succeeded not because of luck, but because Hunter applied his considerable expertise and leadership skills to planning and executing a difficult mission. This willingness to risk total failure to prove his capability represented either extraordinary confidence or extraordinary desperation, likely both. The soldiers who volunteered to follow Hunter on this unauthorized raid merit consideration as well. They faced courts-martial themselves if captured, yet they trusted Hunter's judgment enough to accept these risks. Their willingness to follow him revealed something important about military leadership, that official authority matters far less than demonstrated competence and genuine concern for soldiers' welfare. Hunter had built sufficient trust and respect through previous service that men would follow him even when he had no official authority and was in fact a fugitive. This kind of authentic leadership cannot be created through rank or position alone, but must be earned through consistent demonstration of ability and character. The volunteers who joined Hunter's raid came from diverse backgrounds but shared common characteristics. They were veterans who had seen enough combat to evaluate leadership quality accurately. They had served under incompetent officers and understood the difference between leaders who genuinely cared about their welfare and those who viewed them as expendable resources. They had witnessed Hunter's tactical skill and personal courage firsthand, giving them confidence that his plan had genuine chance of success, despite its audacious nature. They were willing to accept extraordinary risks because they trusted the man leading them. The long-term impact of Hunter's raid on American Special Operations development provides perhaps the most fitting vindication of his approach. The tactics he pioneered became standard doctrine, taught to generations of Special Operations soldiers who never knew his name. His emphasis on thorough preparation, his recognition that difficult approaches might be preferable to facing prepared defenses, his understanding that small, highly trained forces could accomplish objectives beyond their apparent capability. All these insights became foundational to special operations theory. In this sense, Hunter's greatest legacy wasn't his personal redemption, but his contribution to American military capability. The evolution of American Special Operations forces from World War II through subsequent conflicts demonstrates the lasting influence of tactical innovations like Hunter's raid. The establishment of special forces in the 1950s, the development of SEAL teams, the refinement of Ranger doctrine, all incorporated principles that Hunter had demonstrated in Burma. The emphasis on unconventional approaches to conventional problems, the willingness to accept high risk for high-value objectives, the recognition that thorough planning and training could enable small units to achieve disproportionate results. These became hallmarks of special operations culture that traces lineage partly to Hunter's pioneering raid. Yet we should be careful about drawing overly simplistic lessons from Hunter's story. His case doesn't prove that insubordination is justified whenever officers disagree with their superiors, nor that institutional discipline is merely arbitrary restriction on individual judgment. Military effectiveness genuinely does require hierarchical authority and coordinated action at scale, which becomes impossible if every officer feels entitled to refuse orders. Hunter's situation represented an extraordinary combination of circumstances where the normal rules produced unjust outcomes, but such situations are rare precisely because the normal rules generally serve important purposes. The balance between discipline and initiative, between adherence to authority and exercise of independent judgment, represents one of the eternal tensions in military organizations, and indeed in any hierarchical institution. Rules and procedures exist for sound reasons, enabling coordination and preventing chaos. But rigid application of rules, regardless of circumstances, can produce absurd or tragic outcomes. Hunter's case illustrates both the necessity of institutional discipline and its limitations, both the importance of command authority and the need for individual moral judgment. There are no simple formulas for resolving these tensions, only the need for wisdom, judgment, and willingness to accept complexity. The enduring power of Hunter's story lies in its fundamental human drama. A man who refused to accept that his contributions were worthless, who risked everything to prove his value, who achieved vindication through audacity and expertise rather than institutional recognition. His journey from decorated officer to prisoner, to commando leader to quiet retirement captures something essential about the relationship between individual capability and institutional power, about the difference between official status and actual effectiveness, about how people respond when systems designed to facilitate their contributions instead obstruct them. In the end, Charles Hunter's voided Medal of Honor recommendation and his subsequent Amphibious raid represent two different systems of value: institutional recognition versus actual achievement. The military bureaucracy had the power to stamp void on his award, but it couldn't erase his combat effectiveness or his tactical innovations. The raid proved that Hunter's capabilities remained real, regardless of official judgments. This tension between institutional authority and individual reality defines not just military service, but countless human endeavors, where people must navigate systems that claim power to define their worth. Hunter died decades after the war, his contributions largely unrecognized publicly, though appreciated by military professionals who studied special operations history. He never received the Medal of Honor that his original actions merited, never achieved the senior rank his abilities warranted, never obtained full institutional vindication for his challenge to authority. Yet he accomplished something perhaps more significant. He proved through action that institutional judgments about individual worth can be wrong, that capabilities and courage remain real even when officially denied, that a single person with expertise and determination can force even rigid hierarchies to reconsider their assessments. The void stamp on his award recommendation remains in military archives, a physical artifact of institutional power exercised against an individual who challenged authority. But the tactics he pioneered, the raid he led as an escaped prisoner, the principles he demonstrated about special operations effectiveness, these legacies persist in American military doctrine and capability. In this sense, Hunter achieved the ultimate revenge against bureaucratic erasure. His contributions endured and multiplied even when his name was forgotten. The institution could void his award, but it couldn't void his impact. His story reminds us that true heroism sometimes wears uncomfortable forms, that the greatest contributions sometimes come from those who challenge rather than conform, that institutional judgments about worth and capability can be profoundly wrong. Charles Hunter refused to accept the void stamp as the final word on his service and sacrifice. Through courage, tactical brilliance, and sheer determination, he wrote his own ending to a story the military institution had already concluded. And in doing so, he left a legacy that continues to shape how American forces conduct the most dangerous and critical operations, even if few know the name of the escaped prisoner who led that desperate raid through dark waters toward vindication.